Hello dear, today we are going to study the 20th century novel and Ernest Hemingway as the novelist that we are going to cast light on in this lesson. So we are over with poetry and we will introduce novel. After completing this lesson, you should be able to describe the 20th century English novelists and identify them, of course, and define the main trends of modern novel. You have to be able also to evaluate Ernest Hemingway as a modernist novelist. So we have studied modernist poetry, 7 poets, and you will be introduced in this lesson to another literary genre. So it is a movement between genres. Poetry is over and novel is to be introduced. The light has to be cast here on modernist novel and novelists. A background to the life and works of Ernest Hemingway will be provided too. The English novel of the 20th century, its background, the novel, which means the prose narrative that rose in the 18th century and flourished in the 19th century, keeps up its leading position over other literary forms. Its content followed the changes in beliefs and political ideas as a result of the events of the First World War. It means experimentation with form and content. We have here a new technique, that is stream of consciousness. To get more details about all these elements of the 20th century novel and 20th century literature in general, yes, techniques and themes and style and so on, you have to find them in lesson 1. We have here to warm up. Have you read a story by any 20th century novelist, short story, novel, or any type of prose work? Have you? And what do you like in that story? If you read, what do you like in that story? Now we have to cast the light on the most well-known 20th century novelist, English novelist. The first one is E.M. Forster. He was novelist, short story writer, essayist, and librettist. Many of his novels examined class difference and hypocrisy in early 20th century. An example is Howards End. He takes a completely different view of the values which form and govern British society. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 16 different years. For 16 different years he was nominated for the Nobel Prize. That is E.M. Forster. The most well-known novel written by E.M. Forster is A Passage to India. It was written in 1924 and it tackles the relationship between the British and the Indians as England was in rule of India. So it talks about the English governance of India. That is a novel, and it tackles the British and how they are busy with formal manners, unable to see the reality of events as colonizers. The themes: the difficulty of English-Indian friendship. So Miss Adela was supposed to have a relationship with an Indian man, but that relationship came to a failure. The colonizer's superiority complex leads them to a failure. The second 20th century novelist is D.H. Lawrence. As a novelist, his job is to show how an individual's view of his own personality was often affected by conventions of language, family, and religion. He tackles the relationship between people and how it is complex. He reshaped the form of the traditional novel and made it wider and deeper. An example of his novels is Sons and Lovers. It was published in 1913. Paul Murrell in this novel and his relationship itself. The story tells about Paul Murrell and his relationship with his mother. He needs his mother to help him make sense of the world around him, but in order to become an independent man or an artist, he has to struggle to become free from her influence. So it's about the struggle to put the outer and inner world together in a true relation. Another one is The Rainbow. It was published in 1915. It talks about a family through three couples of different ages. Next is James Joyce. That is James Joyce. He was an Irish novelist. Joyce greatly influenced the way English novels were written, with his use of stream of consciousness. His novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, was published in 1916. It presents Joyce himself as a young man in the character of Stephen Dedalus. It shows how he gradually frees himself from the influence of political and religious feelings to follow his own nature and his own faith. Another novel by him is Ulysses. It was written and published in 1922. The technique used in this novel is a stream of consciousness. It's a large novel covering 18 hours in Dublin. So actually the actual time is 18 hours, but it goes in time or through the technique of the stream of consciousness to the future and to the past. It allows the readers to move inside the minds of the characters and presents their thoughts and feelings in a continuous stream. That's why we call it stream of consciousness, stream of thoughts. And it breaks the usual rules of description, speech, and punctuation. The next novelist is Virginia Woolf, the famous she novelist, and she was a feminist. That is Virginia Woolf. She attempts to explore the consciousness of her characters, and she has critical studies on literature and feminism. One of her well-known novels is To the Lighthouse. It was published in 1927. There we find Mr. Ramsay, who represents the truth of facts that can be proved, and Mrs. Ramsay represents an attempt to find the truth that lies below those facts. The next novelist is George Orwell. He focuses on how language could be used to hide the truth, in propaganda, of course. He tackles the theme of governments and how they can use language to deceive people. That is not a date, it is a title of his novel. It is 1984 and it was published in 1949. It describes a world where every word and action is seen and controlled by the state, changing the language so the only words left are those for objects and ideas that the government wants the people to know about. Here we have one of the it is one of the masterpieces in the 20th century literature. It is his novel Animal Farm. Animal Farm is a satire against Russian Revolution. That was its beginning, but it turns out to be a satire of any relationship between the state and the people that is based on propaganda and based on or how to convince the people of the state intentions. The farm animals revolted against Mr. Jones to better off their life. The pigs, however, took so. We have only one human character, that is Mr. Jones, and he has a farm. In that farm there are animals. The animals revolted against Mr. Jones. They thought that he was a dictator and he has to monopolize everything for himself. They revolted to get a better life and better future, but the pigs, however, took power of the farm and became cunning rulers. The pigs made use of propaganda and repression to control the farm. They use rhetoric and propaganda to convince the farm animals that they are the best alternative of human rulers. So, instead of revolting against a dictator, the animal farms replace a dictator with another. Now, we have finished our overview of the 20th century novelist, and we have to move on to Ernest Hemingway as the novelist that we are going to study deeply and in detail. We are going to study his novel, or novella to be more precise, The Old Man and the Sea. But before that, we have to cast the light on his life and style. He belongs to the lost generation. Ernest Hemingway belongs to a group of writers who are called the lost generation. Lost generation is a term used to describe a group of American writers who rejected the values of American materialism and fled to Paris in the post-World War years. They created some of the finest American literature to date. They comprise F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, and Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway, he was born in 1899 and he died in 1961. He was born in Oak Park, Illinois. Hemingway worked as a reporter for the Kansas City Star after graduating from high school in 1917. During the First World War, he served as an ambulance driver for the American Red Cross. He was wounded on the Austro-Italian front just before his 19th birthday. After recovering in the United States, he sailed for France as a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star. In Paris, he became part of the Lost Generation group. During the Spanish Civil War, Hemingway served as a correspondent on the Loyalist side. He fought in the Second World War and then settled in Cuba in 1945. In 1954, Hemingway was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. By 1960, Fidel Castro's revolution had led Hemingway to leave Cuba and settle in Idaho. There, anxiety-ridden, depressed, and ill with cancer, he shot himself, leaving behind many manuscripts. So he committed suicide. His novels, The Sun Also Rises. It was published in 1926. The novel concerns a group of disillusioned expatriates living in post-war Paris. That means the lost generation writers, who take psychic refuge in such immediate physical activities as eating, drinking, traveling, brawling, etc. Second novel was A Farewell to Arms. It was published in 1929. It tells of a tragic wartime love affair between an ambulance driver and an English nurse. It is autobiographical. So these two novels are autobiographical as they describe events happening in the life of the writer himself. Another novel is Death in the Afternoon. It was published in 1932. It is a non-fiction, of course, and it is about bullfighting. For Whom the Bell Tolls, published in 1940, in detailing an incident in the war, argues for human brotherhood. Across the River and Into the Trees, published in 1950. The Old Man and the Sea, it was published in 1952, and it won Pulitzer Prize. Hemingway himself, a great sportsman, liked to portray soldiers, hunters, bullfighters, at times primitive people whose courage and honesty are set against the brutal ways of modern society, loss of hope and faith. So these 3 points are represented by him, by Ernest Hemingway. And his straightforward prose, his spare dialogue, and his use of understatement are particularly effective in his short stories. According to Hemingway, in order to be satisfied with oneself, one must learn to be a friend, to have a friend, to endure physical pain, to handle the death of a loved one, to pass knowledge on to others, to respect greatness in others, to win with humility, to lose with dignity, to struggle with something bigger than yourself, to handle adversity, to resist being discouraged by failure, to appreciate and love nature, to master a skill, to resist following the crowd, to be able to be alone with yourself, to love an adversary even if you must kill him. So all those will be found in his short novel, The Old Man and the Sea. So this lesson introduces you to the main novelists and novels of the 20th century. It casts the light on Ernest Hemingway's life and works. Your assignment you'll find in the file entitled Assignment 6. Thank you.